The airport buzzed with noise-rolling suitcases, departure calls, and the soft hum of tired travelers chasing time. Rachel Wells clutched her boarding pass with both hands, as if it might disappear. Seat 3A, first class. Her first time flying up front, not by luxury, but by loyalty points and quiet perseverance. She hadn't come from money. She came from a modest town, a public school classroom, and long nights caring for her ailing mother. This upgrade felt like a small whisper from the universe. You've earned a little comfort, just this once. She stepped into the cabin carefully, smiled at the flight attendant, and slid into her seat with quiet wonder. Then came the sound of soft footsteps and sobs. A little boy, no older than 6, ran into the cabin clutching a worn-out teddy bear. Behind him, a flustered airline staffer. Around him, whispers, frowns, and judging eyes. And somewhere, in that stillness, everything shifted. What Rachel did next would ripple far beyond this flight. Stay with us until the very end, because sometimes the smallest gestures lift more than just one life. Comment below. Where are you watching this from? What time is it in your area right now? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell. Because every week, we tell true stories of ordinary people who quietly changed everything. Rachel Wells didn't stand out in crowds. She had a face that people forgot. Pleasant, soft, familiar, like the background of a family photo you barely notice. Her clothes were practical, her makeup minimal, and her laugh when it came was gentle and brief. But her eyes carried something else. Not sadness exactly. More like the kind of weariness you earn from giving too much of yourself for too long. She was a third-grade teacher in a public school tucked between cornfields and gas stations. Her classroom walls were lined with handmade posters and paper stars that had started curling at the edges. Her students called her Miss Rachel, and sometimes hugged her too hard. She never pulled away. Outside the classroom, life had not been gentle. Her mother's illness had dragged on for nearly 5 years, a slow, unforgiving unraveling. Rachel had moved back into her childhood home to care for her, juggling lesson plans by day and medication charts by night. She turned down promotions, left her travel dreams in a drawer, and cancelled more invitations than she could remember. When her mother passed away in March, the silence that followed felt almost disrespectful, as if the world should have stopped with her. This trip, just a short domestic flight to attend a small educational conference, wasn't meant to be anything special. She booked the cheapest ticket, packed one modest bag, and printed her schedule on recycled paper. The airline upgrade email had arrived 2 nights ago, completely unexpected. Congratulations, you've been upgraded to first class on flight 829. She'd stared at the message for a long while, unsure whether to believe it. A gift? A mistake? A fluke of the system? Still, she accepted. Not because she needed comfort, but because it was the first time in years something had arrived in her life that didn't demand a sacrifice in return. So when she boarded, she didn't pretend to belong. She didn't gawk either. She just moved quietly, the way she always did, grateful, unseen. And yet, even in the luxury of polished wood paneling and champagne trays, she remained Rachel. The woman who once spent her bonus check on backpacks for kids who didn't have one. The woman who hadn't taken a vacation in nearly 7 years. The woman who still wore the same grey cardigan her students loved to snuggle into during story time. That's who was sitting in seat 3A when the little boy came stumbling into the cabin. She turned when she heard the sob, eyes meeting his red-rimmed, frightened, clutching a bear whose ear was barely hanging on. In that split second, her whole body leaned forward, instinct stronger than protocol. Because Rachel Wells never waited to be asked when someone was hurting. And that moment, quiet and unnoticed by most, was the beginning of everything that would come next. The boy stood frozen near the bulkhead, his chest rising and falling in fast, uneven breaths. He gripped the stuffed bear so tightly it seemed strained. A crew member crouched beside him, whispering in hushed tones that did little to comfort him. His shoes were untied. His jacket hung crooked off one shoulder. His whole frame radiated a kind of small, trembling confusion. Passengers in first class turned, frowned, then returned to their devices and mimosas. One man adjusted his noise-canceling headphones. A woman 2 rows up, clicked her tongue, and muttered something about security. Most looked away. A few stared, but only long enough to cast silent judgment. The flight attendant standing beside the boy offered a forced smile. "I'm so sorry, everyone. We're just trying to sort a small seating issue with an unaccompanied minor." A seating issue. The boy's father, they explained, had boarded late due to a last-minute change in connection. The child had been checked in separately and now had no seat assignment near his guardian. There was no empty seat in first class. And FAA regulations wouldn't allow a child his age to be seated alone in economy, especially not in a different cabin class from his responsible adult. "So, what are you saying?" a man asked, removing his sunglasses. "You're bumping one of us?" "No, sir," the manager assured. "We were hoping someone might be willing to swap cabins temporarily just until we land. We'll offer compensation, of course." Silence. Rachel watched the boy. He hadn't made a sound since stepping into the cabin. But his hands kept twitching against the worn fabric of his bear, and his eyes flicked between the adults like he was trying to read a language he hadn't learned yet. The murmurs rose again. "I've paid for this seat," a woman whispered sharply. "I've got a knee injury," another muttered, suddenly invested in her leg. Rachel didn't speak. She just leaned slightly into the aisle, raising her hand half an inch, not a dramatic gesture, just enough. "If it helps," she said softly, "he can have my seat." The room didn't go silent. No dramatic gasp, just a beata pause, as if the air itself considered her words before moving on. The airline staff blinked. "Ma'am, are you sure?" Rachel was already unbuckling. She bent down, met the boy's eyes, and smiled the kind of smile that teachers reserve for children on their worst days. "Go ahead, sweetheart," she said gently. "You'll be okay." He didn't speak, but he nodded quick, grateful, and shuffled past her like a shadow with legs. Rachel gathered her bag and moved toward the back of the plane. Her new seat was near the galley, beside a toilet that hummed loudly and smelled faintly of bleach. The armrest was loose. The window was smudged. She didn't mind. She settled in without complaint, pulling a book from her tote and opening it, though she wouldn't read a word. What she didn't know, what no one in that cabin knew, was that a man seated far ahead, inside a frosted glass cabin marked "Private," had seen everything. Not from the aisle, not through gossip, but through a security monitor tucked discreetly beneath the drink console. And that man was the boy's father. Elliot Grant didn't like to fly with the public. Not out of arrogance, but necessity. In his world, privacy wasn't a luxury. It was armor. And on this flight, of all flights, he needed it more than ever. He sat in the forward cabin, walled off by smoked glass and soundproof panels. A small security monitor glowed dimly beside his seat, part of the discreet safety protocols his team insisted upon. Normally, he ignored it. But today, a flicker on the screen caught his eye. It was his son, standing alone in the first-class cabin, clutching that ragged teddy bear. The boy looked so small, so lost, like he had the day Elliot first told him that Mommy wasn't coming back. A lump formed in Elliot's throat before he could swallow it down. He leaned forward, watching as flight attendants tried politely, awkwardly, to ask strangers for kindness. He watched as heads turned and turned back, as shoulders lifted and shrugged away. Then, suddenly there she was. A woman, mid-30s maybe, brown hair tied back, no jewelry, clothes simple but clean. She didn't make a speech, she didn't frown. She just stood up, bent down, and gave his son the one thing no one else had offered: a seat and a smile. Elliot exhaled deep and slow. It felt like something had cracked inside his chest. He hadn't cried at the funeral, not when the news came, not even when his son crawled into bed night after night, whispering to the shadows, "Mommy said she'd always be here." He had done what men like him were taught to do. He handled the estate, paid the hospitals, made the calls, shut down the press, kept moving, built walls. But now, watching his son melt into that stranger's kindness, he felt everything he had locked away start to bleed through. This wasn't just about a seat. It was the first time his son had willingly sat beside another adult since the accident. The first time he'd leaned against someone without flinching. The camera feed faded back to standby. Elliot sat back, his fingers resting on his chin. He didn't know the woman's name. She hadn't asked for attention, hadn't known she was being watched, and that, somehow, made it all more piercing. Because true grace never announces itself. It just moves quietly, deliberately, and changes everything it touches. He looked toward the door, as if he might see her through it, but all he saw was the steward closing the curtain. Still, her face was clear in his mind. Calm, steady, kind. He tapped a button on the console. A voice answered through the speaker. "Sir? Find out who she is," Elliot said quietly. "And make sure she doesn't walk off that plane without speaking to me first." Rachel had just stepped off the jet bridge when a woman in a sharp black suit blocked her path. "Ms. Wells?" the woman asked, clipboard in hand. Rachel blinked. "Yes? We'd like to escort you to the VIP lounge. Someone would like a word." Rachel's first instinct was to apologize, as if she'd done something wrong. "Is there a problem?" "No, ma'am," the woman said, with a professional smile. "It's not a complaint, quite the opposite." She was led through a side hallway most passengers never saw, quiet, carpeted, lined with subtle lighting and the faint scent of leather and citrus. The doors at the end slid open without a sound. Inside, polished wood, gold accents, and a man standing beside a small screen. Rachel froze. He was taller than she expected. Silver at the temples, trim suit in charcoal gray. The kind of posture that came from both power and practice. But his eyes were tired, kind, and watching her like she mattered. "Ms. Wells," he said softly, "thank you for coming." She shifted awkwardly. "Is this about the little boy? I wasn't trying to..." He lifted a hand. "Please, sit." She hesitated, then sat. "I didn't introduce myself," he said. "My name is Elliot Grant." The name meant nothing to her, he noticed. "I run Grant Industries. Finance, philanthropy, infrastructure. My team and I just merged with the airline you flew today." Rachel blinked again, unsure how that connected to her. He turned to the screen beside him, tapped a few keys. The monitor lit up. A silent security feed played. The first-class cabin, viewed from a corner angle. There she was, clear as day unbuckling, kneeling beside the boy, offering her seat. Rachel's cheeks flushed. "I didn't know I was being..." "You weren't," he said quickly. "This isn't standard footage. That cabin was being monitored privately, security protocols. I had just boarded late, from the forward suite." She stared at the screen, at her own image frozen mid-smile, then looked back at him. "The boy," he said, "is my son." Her lips parted. "I didn't know." "I know." He stepped closer. That's what made it matter. He lowered himself into the chair across from her. For a long moment he didn't speak, just studied her face like someone memorizing a map he never thought he'd need. "My son hasn't touched another adult, besides me, since his mother died 3 months ago. He flinches when teachers speak too loud. He hasn't slept through a night since the crash." Rachel's hand pressed against her tote bag unconsciously. "I've built companies," Elliot said. "Endowed hospitals, sponsored research. But in that entire time, I couldn't do for my son what you did in a single gesture. You made him feel safe, without asking for anything." "I just gave him a seat," she murmured. "No," he said. "You gave him trust." She looked down, embarrassed. He reached into his coat and pulled out a sleek envelope. "This is a lifetime first-class pass on every airline we own." Her breath caught. I can't accept that." "You already did," he said gently. "You accepted it the moment you stood up, thinking no one was watching." Rachel shook her head slightly, overwhelmed. Sir, I'm just a teacher. I don't need. Exactly why I'm also offering you something else. He leaned forward. I've started a foundation. In my son's name. Focused on education. Real education built around compassion, equity, dignity. I want you on the advisory board. Paid. Respected. Heard. Rachel blinked, searching for words. I don't need someone who's built schools, Elliot added. I need someone who still sees the child in every seat. And today, you showed me. That child doesn't have to be yours to matter. She sat back in the chair, tears rising but held. There was no audience here, no headlines, just a quiet, powerful reckoning. You don't owe me anything, she whispered. I know, he said. He stood and offered his hand. Rachel rose slowly and shook it. And in that simple clasp, soft, steady, unremarkable a teacher and a titan sealed something deeper than a contract. They sealed the truth that grace, when given freely, always finds its way back. Rachel didn't remember walking out of the VIP lounge. She remembered the handshake, the way Elliot Grant had looked her in the eye, not like a billionaire or a benefactor, but like a father who had seen something holy in the ordinary. She remembered the weight of the envelope in her bag, still unopened. But after that, everything blurred into quiet hallways and automatic doors. That night, in her hotel room, she didn't sleep. Not from nerves. From wonder. From a kind of stunned stillness that made the world feel just slightly off-axis. She opened the envelope sometime after midnight. The card inside was matte white, embossed with gold lettering. No expiration, no fine print. Grant. Global access. Lifetime. It didn't feel like a reward. It felt like something heavier, like responsibility. Next to it was a folded letter, hand-signed. We build from people like you, not on their backs, but with their hearts. My son slept through the night for the first time in 3 months after you sat with him. This world needs more of your kind, so let's build something that honors it. Egg. She placed it beside the Gideon Bible in the nightstand drawer, unsure which held more scripture. 3 months later, Rachel was flown this time willingly in first class to the headquarters of the Grant Foundation for Compassionate Education. The space was not what she expected. It wasn't a gleaming skyscraper, but a renovated brick schoolhouse outside Chicago, with vines growing across the outer walls and swings still creaking out back. The boardroom where they met wasn't full of suits. It was full of educators, real ones principals from rural towns, counselors from underserved neighborhoods, teachers like her who didn't carry resumes polished for prestige. Elliot was there, but he didn't lead the meeting. He sat beside his son, quietly coloring in the corner, while Rachel stood before a group of strangers and talked for the first time in her life about what it meant to give without being asked. She didn't mention the airplane. She mentioned a boy named Liam who never brought lunch, so she started forgetting an extra sandwich. She talked about her mother, how teaching was what kept her going through the hardest nights. She told them how a kind act is not a grand act, it's just a small one you don't wait to give. When she finished, no one clapped. Not because they didn't want to, because they understood, deeply, wordlessly. Weeks passed. Her name appeared on the foundation's masthead. She helped build curriculum templates for trauma-informed classrooms, wrote letters to underfunded schools that now came with grants bearing her signature. She returned to teaching part-time, but this time with a platform, not a podium, a voice. The boy, his name was Caleb, sent her drawings in the mail. Always of airplanes. Always with her sitting beside him, a bright yellow sun beaming behind them, her cardigan colored soft gray with waxy strokes. One day, tucked into a crayon portrait, was a note written in shaky 6-year-old letters. Thank you for giving me your seat, but I think it was yours all along. Rachel cried then, not out of pride, but from the sudden understanding that a gesture doesn't have to be loud to echo. Elliot never tried to name a wing after her. He never spoke of legacy. What he did do was simple. He listened. When she spoke, he didn't interrupt. When she doubted herself, he reminded her gently, "You taught my son the meaning of dignity. That matters more than any deal I've ever signed. And somehow, somewhere along the way, the woman who never asked for more finally had enough. Enough voice, enough purpose, enough room in the world to believe that she belonged not because she demanded a seat, but because she had always been the kind of person who would give hers away. The ballroom glittered with the kind of light Rachel never thought would touch her. Crystal chandeliers swayed gently above linen-draped tables. Soft jazz hummed beneath the sound of forks clinking against porcelain. It was the inaugural Grant Foundation Gala, held in Chicago's historic Halstead Conservatoria venue that once hosted presidents, opera legends, and now, a third-grade teacher from a town that barely made the map. Rachel stood near the entrance in a deep navy blue dress, modest and borrowed, her hands lightly clasped in front of her. She had arrived alone, declined the offered stylist, chose flats instead of heels, and still, somehow, she belonged. Elliot Grant had opened the evening with few words, just a quiet toast. To the people who make room for others, you know who you are. The spotlight didn't move to Rachel then. It didn't need to, not yet. Midway through the evening, a host stepped onto the stage. "Tonight," she said, "we honor the story that inspired this foundation. A story that began not with a tragedy but with a choice. A quiet one, a kind one, and a woman who never asked to be thanked." A slow hush fell over the room. The screen behind the stage lit up not with the now famous footage, but with a child's crayon drawing, a woman in a cardigan, a boy beside her, an airplane window with the sun shining through. Rachel felt her breath catch. "Please welcome," the host continued, "our keynote speaker, our compass, Ms. Rachel Wells." Applause rose soft at first, then full, then standing. Rachel walked slowly to the podium. Not with confidence, but with presence. She didn't carry notes. She didn't need them. She rested her palms on the wood, took one breath, and began. "I'm not a speaker," she said. "I'm not a philanthropist or a visionary. I'm just someone who noticed a little boy who looked scared and couldn't stay seated." A few smiles flickered. Eyes leaned in. "I didn't give him much. Just a seat. Just a moment. I thought it would end there, but I was wrong." She paused, looking at the crowd, not at the gowns or tuxedos or titles but at the people. It turns out that kindness is never small. It ripples in ways we never see. It teaches without words. And sometimes, it brings broken things back together. Rachel's voice didn't rise. It never needed to. The room was silent, drinking every word like breath. "I don't belong here because of what I did," she said gently. "I belong here because someone believed it mattered." She stepped back. No flourish, no crescendo, just truth. The applause this time didn't rise fast. It swelled like water against the shore. Some guests wiped their eyes, others didn't try to hide it. From the side of the stage, Elliot stood beside his son, now dressed in a tiny suit. The boy held a teddy bear, stitched carefully at the seams. When Rachel passed, he reached out and took her hand. And for one perfect moment, the teacher, the tycoon, and the child stood together in a silence louder than any ovation. The train ride home was quiet. Rachel sat by the window, her shoes kicked off beneath the seat, the gala program folded neatly in her lap. Outside, the countryside blurred past in shades of gold and dusk, fields stretching out like memories that no longer hurt. She'd declined the foundation's offer to send a car, said no to the suite they reserved at the W Hotel. She had a classroom to get back to, spelling tests to grade, a leaky faucet that still hadn't fixed itself. She didn't need a spotlight. She had chalk and windows that stuck in winter. That was enough. What wasn't the same, though what would never be the same, was how the world looked at her now. Or maybe, how she finally allowed herself to be seen. Her mailbox, once stuffed with catalogs and grocery flyers, now held handwritten letters from children, from parents, from fellow teachers who had watched the gala online and said, "Thank you for reminding us why we chose this." The foundation kept its promise. Her curriculum was being piloted in 7 states. They'd flown her out to consult once more, but she always returned home by Sunday. Back to the crooked row of daffodils by her porch, back to the silence she had made peace with long ago. She didn't spend the first-class pass. Not right away. It sat tucked inside a book of Emily Dickinson poems, wrapped in a ribbon her mother once used to tie her hair. One day she would use it. Maybe to visit the children she'd never had time to see graduate. Maybe to meet with a principal across the country who thought dignity was too abstract to teach until she walked into his school and showed him otherwise. But for now, she stayed. Because the world didn't need her to go farther. It just needed her to keep being who she was, where she already stood. Sometimes at night, she thought about the boy, Caleb, how his hand had felt in hers as they left the stage, how for a moment he had looked up at her not as someone who saved him, but as someone who had simply seen him. That was all she ever wanted for one child, one stranger, to know that they weren't alone. She hadn't lifted her voice at 30,000 feet. She hadn't made a scene. She had just given her seat away. And in doing so, lifted a family, a future, and a faith in humanity that had almost forgotten how to rise. She didn't wear diamonds. She didn't speak like the rich. But in a cabin full of silence, she was the only one who stood up and in doing so, lifted an entire family higher than first class ever could.